Modulation. This word in its basic form is modulate. And what do you mean by modulate? Modulate means to change. So that means modulation means the process of changing. Students, before we could start with getting into much more details of modulation, let us just recall one of our old epic, that is Ramayana. I hope you all know the story of Ramayana. Let us just focus on one particular situation here where Sita was actually abducted by Ravan, and then Lord Ram comes in search of Sita, and on the way he also meets Hanuman. Later, Hanuman also carries one of Ram's message and he goes to Lanka actually. So let us focus a little bit more in detail about this situation. Students, when Hanuman decided that he is going to be the messenger of Ram, he's going to carry a message of Ram. Actually, the message was Ram's ring, if you remember. So Ram had given a ring to Hanuman and told that you go and give this to Sita, convey that I'm coming in search of her. So once Hanuman decided that yes, he's going to carry this message of Lord Ram and he's going to Lanka, what he did is, in front of him he had a huge ocean which he had to cross by. So the first thing what Hanuman did is he changed himself in one of his characteristic. The characteristic that he took up was his size. So what Hanuman did is he just blew himself up to a very huge size. The reason is simple. It became very easy for Hanuman to fly across such a huge ocean. This process itself is modulation, students. Here, Hanuman, who was smaller in size, or his normal size was something like this, he underwent a huge change for a purpose. The purpose was to carry the ring that was given by Ram. So here, the ring is nothing but the message. And who is carrying it? Lord Hanuman is carrying it. So he becomes the carrier of the message. Now students, Hanuman flew all the way to Lanka, and there once he reached Lanka, the main thing what he did there was, before he could present himself in front of Sita, he came back to his original size, that is his normal size. This process is nothing but demodulation, students. So modulation is undergoing the change. Undoing that change is demodulation. This is all about modulation and demodulation. So now, if we have to define this process of modulation, it is nothing but a process wherein some characteristic is changed. When we spoke about Hanuman, the characteristic that he opted was his size. And when we talk about any electromagnetic signals, the characteristic that has is either its amplitude, frequency, or phase that we talk about. So here what we do is we either change the amplitude or frequency or phase of the signal. Students, just get back to that example. Who underwent change there? The message or the carrier? The carrier underwent change. So similarly, here also, the carrier undergoes a change either in its amplitude, frequency, or phase. Now, coming back to the next part of the definition, it is a process of changing some characteristic, that is amplitude, frequency, or phase of high frequency carrier wave. Students, if you compare the size of ring with the size of Hanuman, it is quite obvious that Hanuman needs to be quite very big when compared with the ring, because only if the carrier is large enough and capable enough of carrying the message he can carry. Alternatively, just imagine a situation wherein the ring is very huge and Hanuman is very small. So that time carrying becomes a question. So always it is a necessity that the one who is carrying is much more stronger, much more bigger in size than the message. And when we talk about EM waves, here the carrier signal has high frequency. Why it has high frequency? Why am I mentioning it here? Students, the EM wave has its energy which is proportional to its frequency. So that means higher the frequency, higher is its energy, and lower the frequency, lower is its energy. So here we are talking about carrier wave which has higher energy, so that means quite obviously its frequency has to be high. And when we talk about the message is a smaller object. So similarly, the frequency of the message signal will be quite low. Now, getting back to our example, when a message had to be sent from Ram to Sita, the requirements were two. One, the message itself. Second one, the carrier of the message. Similarly, when we relate this situation to modulation in electronic terms, what it means is here the two requirements still do exist, but in a different form. The message here will be an EM signal, that is electromagnetic signal, or any other audio signal. Along with that, there will be a carrier which is nothing but another EM signal, a high frequency signal. Reading the next part of this definition, in accordance with the instantaneous voltage. Modulation is a process of changing some characteristic, which could be amplitude, frequency, or phase of high frequency carrier wave in accordance with instantaneous voltage of low frequency message signal. Now, what do you mean by this in accordance with? In accordance with means depending upon. So, how the characteristic of the carrier wave will be changed, that will depend on the message signal. So, that is why we are using this set of words here, that is in accordance with. Instantaneous voltage, I hope you all know what it means. It is nothing but the amplitude of the signal at a given instant of time. Okay, so now let's get back to the complete definition. Modulation is nothing but a process of changing some characteristic, which could be the amplitude or frequency or phase of high frequency carrier wave in accordance with the instantaneous voltage of low frequency message signal. The message signal is also known as baseband signal or intelligence signal, or also as modulating signal or information signal. Now, why we call this as modulating signal is because, as I already told you, this set of words in accordance with, it means that the characteristic of the carrier wave is varied depending upon the message signal. So, it is the message signal that decides to what an extent the carrier wave has to change, or the carrier wave has to undergo modulation. That is why you call the message signal as modulating signal. And the high frequency signal, we have already introduced that to you as it is a carrier signal. Once the signal undergoes modulation, this signal is now known as modulated signal. So students, here these two words must not be confused, modulated and modulating. The message signal which decides the amount of modulation on the carrier part is called as modulating signal, and once the signal has undergone modulation, then it is known as modulated signal. Now let's just look into the basic block diagram of modulator. You can see here message signal is one of the inputs given to this block, and carrier signal is the other input given to this modulator block. The output is nothing but the modulated signal. This is the message signal or the intelligence signal or the modulating signal. This is a carrier signal, and this is the signal that is coming out of the modulator after undergoing modulation. So this is nothing but modulated signal. Now let's just see what is the need for modulation. Why at all do we need modulation? Students, this particular topic, it is one of the important topic and normally targeted for 2 marks or 3 marks. There are some advantages of undergoing modulation. If those advantages would not exist, perhaps modulation would not have become such an important thing in communication. So the first advantage it gives to us is the height of the antenna. For effective communication, it is always a basic requirement that the height of the antenna should be quarter the wavelength of the signal. So that means if lambda is the wavelength of the signal, the height of the antenna should roughly be lambda by 4. And you already know that lambda is given as c by f, where c is nothing but the speed of light and f is the frequency of the signal. So now if I substitute this value of lambda onto this equation, what I get is h is equal to c by 4f. So that means observe this equation. Here h is inversely related to f, or the height of the antenna is inversely related to the frequency of the signal. So that means if I have to transmit a signal with very low frequency, maybe something around 100 Hz or 1000 Hz, what happens is the height of the antenna required would scale up to several kilometers. And practically that is very highly impossible. Alternatively, if the value of f increases, automatically the value of h decreases. So that means as the frequency of the signal increases, the height of the antenna required decreases. So what? So what is the relation between modulation and this? The relation is simple, students. If the height of the antenna required is lesser for higher frequency signals, when we do the process of modulation, what happens is after modulation, the frequency of the signal is increased. So as the signal becomes of higher frequency now, automatically the height of the antenna required is reduced. So this is one of the major advantage of modulation. Coming on to the next advantage, the energy of the signal. I already told you that the energy of a EM wave is directly dependent on its frequency. So once we modulate a signal, its frequency increases. So automatically its energy increases. So once the energy of the signal increases, it also helps us in long distance communication. That means the signal can easily travel over long distances. It also helps in avoiding interference and noise in the signal. And another major advantage is it helps in multiplexing. Now, what do you mean by multiplexing? Multiplexing is a technique used for transmitting several signals simultaneously over the same channel. It is something like at the same given point of time, on a single road, you can see many vehicles moving. Consider each vehicle to be a signal. So it is the same road that is being used simultaneously by all the users. Similarly, in case of multiplexing, what we do is in the same channel, several signals are transmitted simultaneously, and this technique is known as multiplexing. Students, some time back, if you remember, we had discussed about the three characteristics of the carrier wave that can be changed. Now, depending upon which characteristic we are changing, accordingly, we have three different types of modulation. In case if we opt to change the amplitude of the carrier wave, then we call this type of modulation as amplitude modulation. Alternatively, if we select to change the frequency of the carrier signal, then we call it as frequency modulation. The third option is if we decide to change the phase of the carrier signal, then we call it as phase modulation. Now observe the three definitions. They all are nothing but the same set of words that is used. Only thing is there is one change here. In case of amplitude modulation, it is defined as the process of changing amplitude of high frequency carrier wave. When you come to frequency modulation, the same set of words, only thing is the word amplitude is changed to frequency. Again, when you talk about phase modulation, it is again the same set of words used for the definition, whereas only the word amplitude is now changed to phase. So remembering all the three definitions are quite easy, I believe. And from this particular chapter, students, the most commonly asked question is the definition of amplitude modulation or the definition of frequency modulation for 1 mark. So please be thorough with these definitions. With this, students, we complete the introduction to this particular chapter. In the next video, we will discuss about amplitude modulation in detail. Thank you, students. Bye.